Hello, hello. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever you happen to be listening to this little sermon. I bid you a good one. Today, we are going to be continuing a little series, the Sing to the Lord a New Song series. And to do so, today we are going to be exploring a particular text in Psalms, Psalm 96. So if you happen to have your Bible around in your close proximity, I welcome you and invite you to pull it out and we'll read along together, or you can just listen and follow. If you happen to have another translation, I've got an NIV. No worries. It's always cool to kind of compare and contrast the different translations and how they're kind of articulating it. We can get different perspectives in that way, which is very cool and exciting. So I'm just going to read. Feel free to follow along. Jump right in. Psalm 96. Sing to the Lord a new song. Sing to the Lord, all the earth. Sing to the Lord, praise his name. Proclaim his salvation day after day. Declare his glory among the nations, his marvelous deeds among all peoples. For great is the Lord, and most worthy of praise. He is to be feared above all gods. For all the gods of the nations are idols, but the Lord made the heavens. Splendor and majesty are before him. Strength and glory are in his sanctuary. Ascribe to the Lord, all you families of nations. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory due to his name. Bring an offering and come into his courts. Worship the Lord in the splendor of his holiness. Tremble before him, all the earth. Say among the nations, the Lord reigns. The world is firmly established. It cannot be moved. He will judge the peoples with equity. Let the heavens rejoice. Let the earth be glad. Let the sea resound and all that is in it. Let the fields be jubilant and everything in them. Let the trees of the forest sing for joy. Let all creation rejoice before the Lord, for he comes. He comes to judge the earth. He will judge the world in righteousness and the peoples in his faithfulness. Just put that bibble down there. Well, there's a fair bit to unpack in that, hey? It's kind of suiting at the moment that I'm doing this from my little indoor rainforest. I'm quite an avid collector of plants. It just kind of pops everything up a bit and fun to grow. Very appeasing aesthetic. But it's kind of fitting in some sense of the natural world is quite a significant theme in this text. All the talk of trees and the seas and the skies and paying due to God. That's cool for a number of reasons. One of which, though, sticks, like one of the points that comes to me at least, that really sticks out in that is perhaps a challenge to some of the mindsets that we can have, which has developed in a lot of Western thought, which has its roots in a lot of Greco-Roman philosophies. I'm talking, of course, of dualism. So to summarize, dualism is essentially the mindset of polar opposite and contrast that is places one thing above the other in terms of importance, of significance, of being the better. We can become very black and white. We must acknowledge that in tradition of Western thought and Christendom, the earth has sometimes got the short end of the stick in that. It's a bit of a vestige of that Greco-Romanized way of thinking, that sharp dualism that seeks to, within the tradition, seeks to be a bit of a superiority complex. And you find that in a lot of those kinds of contrasts that we might not even think about or recognize a lot of the time. And it kind of has, over time, devalued the voice of the earth and put it at an opposite ends, perhaps, to the spiritual. So, for example, these hierarchical dualisms underpin Western thought, for example, civilized versus primitive, reason versus emotion, culture versus nature, human versus nature, spiritual versus material, heavenly versus earthly, sacred versus profane. These sharp dualisms that separate these things, it's whether we recognize it or not, is a very Western way of thinking, that we have these sharp divides between the earthly and the heavenly and the spiritual and the material. Usually in the tradition, the material has got kind of is regarded as the lower end of that. Oh, it's not as important as the spiritual. They're two different things all the time by default, and the sharp divide that exists there. And sometimes the earth can be thought of as something in the Christian tradition, especially during medieval ages, and that was thought of as we must escape this place. We must escape the material because it's so corrupt. I love texts like this because it particularly challenges that. Now, it challenges in a number of ways. Most importantly is, where is the significance of this text? Okay, it's the appraisal of God through which medium? Nature. It's not sharply dividing the spiritual and the material as the material can't reflect God. No, it's not saying that. In fact, it seems to be highlighting that it resounds the song of God, that it is amplifying the joy and wonder that is just such a lovely song to God. Now, if the material was so sharply divided and that it can't have a say in that, and that spirituality and material are somehow two polar opposites in this dualistic spectrum, that couldn't happen. But yet texts like this highlight that point. It highlights the significance of the flesh and blood of this material world and the spirituality entwined with that. These things are entwined. The spiritual and material are so deeply entwined together. And that's beautiful. Because we need to really highlight the importance of the fact that creation was made first and foremost good. And it wasn't exactly a dropped concept. All through the Hebrew texts and that, it continues to use nature and creation as examples of God's goodness, and keeps bringing these similar points as this Psalm 96 reflects, of it singing a joyous song in appraisal to God. That is beautiful. And that is something that we cannot neglect to take note of. Because if the created order isn't just merely something to escape from into some detached heavenly entity, and that's all, like, if that's all that this world and life is, then that doesn't seem to be reflected in a text like this. In fact, it seems to contrast that, and pointing out that this stuff is good, it's important. These biological systems are something that we can't merely simply detach from in a simple way. It's important. And to neglect that is to neglect the goodness of that. Hey, I have an idea. Let's go for a walk. There we are. Awesome.
Who else is super excited about this 25 kilometres being disbanded? Could start going on some more adventures into the wilderness spaces. Look, this text is amazing in the way that it seems to also really emphasize another point of creation, is that it's not just all about humanity. It has its own voice. Creation is given its own voice to glorify God. We can sometimes get caught up in everything revolves around humanity, but here we have a text that's illustrating creation existing for its own sake, and that's a beautiful thing. It casts it and liberates it with a voice, and casts it not as just the mere backdrop for humanity. No, it's not just a set piece, a stage background for our starring role and that. No, it's given its own right to be its own starring role, and I think that's beautiful. It highlights that nature is so entwined with the spiritual as well. It's singing praise to God, and that is incredibly profound when you stop to really think about the contrast in the midst of that. When sometimes we've created these walls between humanity and nature and spiritual and material. No, they're more interlinked and interconnected. And I think we need to really note that, because it's a negligence on that part that does result in justification for treating the natural world like crud. I love texts like this because it really takes note of the song, and we can tune into that song. Some of my most beautiful, profound God experiences have been in those spaces of nature, those thin spaces that can arise there, where you start to attune to that song, perhaps, that the trees are singing, that the winds are blowing through the trees, and in the power of the sea, and in the sky and the land, and all that stuff. Experiences like Cape Shank, I've had some beautiful moments just in the space of the waves crashing against the shore, and the sheer power of that. You feel like a sense of awe, a sense of humility. I think of trips to places like Starling's Gap, visiting the Ada tree, massive mountain ash tree, and you put your hand on it and you can feel the history. And there's a thin space there. You can almost resonate that song, and you feel that joy. I think of trips to Uluru, and going out into Katajuta and overlooking the valley, and you just close your eyes for a moment and you hear, you feel, you sense that there is some deep, harmonious song. This is the kind of concept this text is playing with. You can attune, and I'm sure perhaps you guys have had similar experiences in spaces like that, where you can really hear and feel something more in those wilderness spaces. They say that going out into nature and going for bushwalks and that, it has genuine health properties as well, in a sense. Like, it's actually super good for your mental health and physical. So, like, there's some great works and published papers on that highlight that going for a walk on a regular basis in a space like this, forest bathing or something like that, it can lower pressure. Hold on, I'm going to get my notes. And officially, there's been some good scientific research into studying this stuff, and they found that participants that spent a day in the forest had lower concentrations of cortisol, lower pulse rate, and lower blood pressure. So there's something about being in nature that really just brings life to us. When we start to attune and hear that song, it can be beautiful to our mental health and physical health. There's cool little studies that go into just the happiness of people when there's a few plants around the home, a few plants in the office, a bit greener in the streets. And the effects that can have on people is actually quite noteworthy. It can make all the difference to feeling like you're having a drab day or not. It really does make a difference, which is just incredibly fascinating. It kind of shows that we are almost longing for that relationship with nature. We need that relationship with nature. Otherwise, it does affect us in curious ways. And I think that's beautiful. I think that's important. Here's some little rosellas up there. Ooh, I wonder if I can even see them. There you go. The songs in nature can be curious ones. Oh, some kookaburras. And in the distance you can kind of hear some Australian ravens. Sometimes even the voices of nature, the songs of nature, can almost seem a bit harsh to us, or curious to us, or not as romanticized as we might think. Like the raven call, for example, is like rah, rah, red wattlebird, wakak, wakak. Some people really don't like those calls, but the fascinating thing is that it seems that God finds them appealing. and that's amazing. That God is in the midst of creation and not an absentee God. God's not a entity that is not even connected with nature. No, text like this seems to emphasize that that's not the case. Another cool point, I think, and I think I've talked about this previously for a communion one time when I was fascinated by this concept, but it's very relevant to this, I guess, text and this walk. We're seeing plenty of trees around us. There's a lot of cool further studies into something called the Wood Wide Web. It's this thing where we used to think that trees were all just competing against each other and it was relentless and survival of the fittest by default and that kind of stuff. But what we're finding is a complex network going on of where the trees are interweaving and interconnecting with each other in these profound ways that are bringing life to one another. So they're sharing nutrients, they're sharing and exchanging data and information that can help others survive better. A healthy community is a healthy tree. So these trees are connecting with all the mycorrhizal fungi and all the networks in that, tapping into all the ecological fungi and bacteria that are helping it to grow, and it's helping other trees to grow, even other species of tree. Because the overall benefits of not going it alone is incredible, and it's important, and it's needed. So that is amazing, and that is a reflection of community. Now, if we are to learn from that, what does that tell you about how we do things sometimes? Sometimes humanity is not necessarily connected in with all the different variants and varieties and thoughts and streams. But the Wood Wide Web seems to have us beat there. We can learn from that. The song of creation, then, is a connected one. The song of creation is one that resounds together, bringing that glorification to God. Now, however we might understand that, I think there's plenty to glean from that through a whole myriad of perspectives. We need texts like this to kind of highlight nature's importance. Otherwise, we kind of neglect that. And I love that. That's a good little eco-theology text right there. Another aspect I think we need to learn from, especially not even just right now, but in honor of NAIDOC Week, I actually brought another little book along. It's called Rainbow Spirit Theology. And it's got this particular, hold on, I'll just put that there as I kind of ruffle through my things. Here we go. This guy. Now that book is by the Rainbow Spirit Elders. So they're a group of Aboriginal people that are interpreting Jesus through their cultural lens. Back in the earlier days, there was a lot of Europeans, white folk, telling Aboriginal people what to think about Jesus, about the Bible. And we seem to have forgotten that we have our own cultural lens, that we have our own histories or philosophies that have helped us interpret the text in certain ways, and neglected the voice of the First Nations people when it comes to understanding the gospel, understanding Jesus. But Aboriginal people started reading the text, interpreting through their cultural lens. So the song of creation then is a connected one. Now, I want to share another thing with you, especially in honour of NAIDOC Week. Often in these kinds of conversations, historically, we must acknowledge that Aboriginal voices had been neglected in Christian theology and thought, in understanding some of these themes. But there's some really good stuff going on in the communities of where and they perhaps always have been in some sense, but Europeans have always been trying to impose a particular way of interpreting a text. Not understanding that we ourselves have cultural baggage, that we have our own cultural understandings that are very entwined with our historical philosophies and thought and ways of thinking about things. This is a problem, especially if we're not aware of it, because we need to be taking note, perhaps, of some of our own biases, especially when we're bringing that to text. No one is free from their contexts. It's very hard to do. But there's some good movements around some Aboriginal thinkers that are visiting the gospel and interpreting Jesus through their cultural lens, which I think is an incredibly amazing thing, because we can glean and learn so much from that, from other perspectives. Now, one little book I want to put on your reading list, this guy, Rainbow Spirit Theology. It's of a mob, many mobs, that have kind of come together, Christian Aboriginal peoples that are now interpreting Jesus through their cultural lens. The Rainbow Spirit Elders, the ones behind this book, they converse about God in ways that challenge some of our European perspectives. And I think that's super important, because we need that to grow and learn. I want to highlight, especially in this particular text, because I think it's relevant, some of the workshop stuff that they talk about creation and their connection with it, and a more holistic approach to salvation, perhaps. We do not understand the gospel in a narrow sense, which focuses exclusively on rescuing souls from personal sin and arranging their transfer to heaven. Christ came to redeem lives, communities, and ultimately all creation from all the forces of evil at work in the land. Life for us means life on the land, to point to heaven as our homeland, and therefore to deny our spiritual life. Connection with this land is to deny our very identity and our spiritual nature. As one of the workshop participants said, I feel deep spiritual connection with the land. When that connection is broken, I suffer. Has Christ come to break that connection or to restore it? These are awesome questions to be pondering, especially in light of texts like this that seem to give voice to the earth and not just as some backdrop for the whole drama to play out. Here it takes center stage in its praise to God. Noteworthy, incredibly noteworthy. And something about when we go back into nature spaces and really connect with the trees and the wider world like that. It's good for our soul. It's good for our body. It's good for our life. That is beautiful. I think I really love the imagery that is presented in things like this and through interpretations, like listening to some of those voices that really bring about a more holistic approach to salvation that paints it not just merely as this sliver thing, but it's relevant for the cosmos, for the wider nature, for the trees, the song singing, those kinds of appraisals. For today, for communion, I got a little creative. I didn't bring any bread, I didn't bring any wine, no. Instead, for bread, I found myself a appleberry. And for the wine, today I'll be using some native cherry. Now, important note, if you're bushwalking or wandering around, don't eat it unless you know exactly what it is. There's a lot of things in the Australian context, fruit-wise and vegetable-wise, that could mess you up. So, there's my little disclaimer. But yeah, if you have your communion ready, and it can be creative. Like, I love the idea that Jesus used what was around him. It was culturally relevant at the time. It was one of the most abundant things in the community. Bread and wine. Wine and bread was everywhere for them. He didn't use self-raising flour as we do today, but yet we do it for our cultural context, and it's still a reminder and a remembrance thing. And I love that imagery that Jesus, use what you got, use what you have at your disposal. So yeah, if you'd like to join me, partake of your bread, and let us remember. Drink ye all of it. Thank you for joining me today on my little bushwalk. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing you guys in real life real soon. It's not long now. We're almost there. Going into church again and seeing y'all in person, not far. Look forward to it, guys. Thanks.